Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We'll give folks a couple of minutes to all get in. In the meantime, we've got some slides about this presentation and the West Virginia Center on Climate Change and other work that we've been doing. So welcome, and we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. We're going to let folks have another minute or so to get in, and then we'll start our program. Welcome, everyone. We'll give everyone just one more minute to get in, and we'll get started right about 7:02. Good evening, everyone. We'll stop the slides now at this point, and I'd like to welcome everyone today. I'm Michael Jones. I'm the Vice Chair of the West Virginia Center on Climate Change, and welcome to our presentation, Carbon Removal and More, What Lies Ahead for These Climate Solutions. We're very honored today to have as our featured speaker, Dr. Julio Friedmann, who is a Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Energy Policy at Columbia University. Dr. Friedmann's going to be joined by our panelist, Erin Burns, who's the Executive Director of Carbon 180, and Dr. Emily Grubert, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Carbon Management with the U.S. Department of Energy. This program today is sponsored by the West Virginia Center on Climate Change, the West Virginia College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, and a new sponsor today of West Virginia Bridge Initiative for Science and Technology Policy, Leadership and Communication. So we appreciate our sponsors very much. Procedurally, what we're going to do is we will have, I will introduce Dr. Friedmann more formally, and he will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. During this time, I will turn off my camera as will the panelist. We'll then reconvene with the panelist and introduce them a little more formally and ask them to comment on the procedure so far. You all are very important participants by coming to this presentation. I know we're all getting Zoom tired, but appreciate you doing one more Zoom meeting. This is an interactive seminar presentation. There is a question and answer box. We invite you to ask your questions in the Q&A box, and I, as moderator, will assemble them. And if questions are together, combine them for our panelist or our speaker. There's not really a procedure to raise your hands or to speak. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our primary speaker who you're here to talk today. And thank our panelists for also being here. Dr. Friedmann is one of the most widely known and authoritative experts in the United States on carbon removal, which of course is CO2 drawdown from the air and the oceans, CO2 conversion and use for carbon to value, hydrogen as a power source, industrial decarbonization, and carbon capture and sequestration. He received his Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his PhD in geology at the University of Southern California. He's held positions at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and is currently CEO of Carbon Wrangler LLC, an advisor to Carbon Direct, and a distinguished associate at the Energy Futures Initiative, as well as his work at Columbia University. In these capacities, he's worked with the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Treasury. And so without further ado, Dr. Friedmann, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody here at the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. It is really a treat to be here tonight, and I'm just delighted to do it. I wish I could be there in person with you. Some future date, perhaps. Let's dive right into it. CO2 removal is an important topic. And reason why is because arithmetic matters. A whole bunch of people are making net zero commitments. And if you can add to zero, you can figure out that any emissions must be matched by removals. If you emit, you must unemit an equal amount. We look at this in a forward way. Today, the core arithmetic of net zero is very much daunting and difficult. We have to go from 51 billion tons a year to zero. And we have about 30 years to do it, and that's very hard. Every year of delay makes the problem worse, and about 50% of what we need to do isn't fielded yet. Fundamentally, this carbon's got to go back in the earth. And you can quibble about the edges, but fundamentally, natural systems are more or less in balance. We can put some carbon back into them, especially the carbon we've lost, but the biosphere has limited capacity, and that means at the end of the day, CO2 return to the geosphere is an anchor of a net zero global economy. You just can't get there without it. I'm sure you're all familiar with this part, so I'll go quickly. Climate change is chronic, it's bad, it's getting worse. We are having our family stroll through the book of Revelations this year with fires and floods and freezing. If you're in California or Texas, you get all three of those. We have ocean acidification, sea level rise, coral die-offs, fair weather flooding all over Florida. It's just bad. And, you know, that's how it is. We also know, because of the science, that this is largely attributable to human actions, which is fine too. Today, the UN Environmental Program released their emissions gap report, and it's still grim. Basically, if we want to get in the range of useful reductions, we have to do what happened last year during COVID, that same amount of reduction every year for the next 10 years. Said differently, bare minimum, we have to reduce 10 billion tons a year. In point of fact, we probably have to reduce more like 30 billion tons a year. And in point of fact, there's completely unprecedented in human history. There's nothing even close to it. The policies that we are on right now actually don't reduce emissions. Policies we're on right now flatline emissions, which is better than increase, but nowhere close to net zero. So there's just a lot of work to do. This means that we must also store CO2 from the air and oceans. We got to pull it out or we're in trouble. In short, if you just look at the CO2 part of that 50 billion, which is about 40 billion, we know how to get rid of about 30 billion tons a year of that. And that will include a whole bunch of things: renewables, efficiency, carbon capture and storage, and other things. It is also the case that we have about 10 billion tons that we have no idea how to reduce. We just don't have the technologies. We don't have the answers to reduction of about 10 billion tons. So we got about 70 or 80% of the solution solved. The rest, we got nothing. That's where we need to get the removals. 5 or 10 billion tons a year removed from the air and oceans. That is extremely daunting. The oil and gas industry today moves about 5 billion tons a year of stuff. So we're talking about an enterprise twice the size of the oil and gas industry working in reverse. If you don't think this is hard, you're not paying attention. It's unquestionably extremely hard. So in short, the era of happy talk is over. The good news is that that's good news. When we thought that this was easy in happy talk, we weren't focused, but in fact, now we are. And carbon management, in particular CO2 removal, has changed and matured as a topic in important ways. For example, in the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, just came out a little over a month ago, all paths require large-scale carbon management to achieve net zero. And in fact, CO2 removal is singled out in a new way as necessary for stabilization. That is welcome and a departure from the happy talk of the past. This is also matched in global markets. All nations now are Paris signatories. Over 100 nations have made net zero commitments, which means they have accepted that we must have CO2 removal as part of the mix. And in fact, many of those nations have included CO2 removal in their 2030, 2040, and 2050 commitments. It is also the case that corporate giants have made the same kind of commitments. About 2,000 companies worldwide, about 20% of the world's biggest companies have agreed to net zero commitments, and in fact have specifically said that CO2 removal will be part of that. Just one example of one group, the UN Asset Owners Alliance. This is a group of companies that has about $10 trillion of assets under management. They have said that they'll have net zero, and in fact recently released a report explaining why CO2 removal is part of that commitment. In short, carbon management and CO2 removal are poised to become the largest markets in human history. That is good news. If you're paying attention, again, that means that there's an opportunity in this which is unheralded and unprecedented. I like to think about these things in the context of a circular carbon economy. In the circular carbon economy, one must reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a very big way. There is no substitute for that. Reduction is an important component of the work. What you can't reduce, you can reuse, recycle, or remove. In those framings, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, CO2 recycling, and carbon capture and use, things like bioenergy and carbon mineralization, these are all parts of a circular carbon economy. They are a component of the work and a happy component of the work that complements and augments all other pathways. To underscore that, this is just one example. This is the International Energy Agency's 2 degrees scenario set. And basically, in this, carbon capture and storage is about as big as any other thing. It's about as big as wind, it's about as big as solar, it's about as big as biofuels, it's bigger than efficiency in nuclear. And this still does not get us to stabilization in a safe way, so you have to add the CO2 removal on top of that. It's important to note that without just conventional carbon capture and storage, most of the energy models fail, and it costs 140% more to do the job. In their most recent systems, all 1.5 degree stabilization models have about 4 billion tons a year of carbon capture, and again, about 2 to 5 gigatons of removal by 2050 with something like direct air capture or bioenergy with CCS or something else. Just a second on CCS. I know this crowd's familiar with this already. I won't belabor the point. By the numbers, over 10 nations now have commercial facilities, and over 10 nations have CCS as part of their nationally determined contributions. There's 22 operating facilities worldwide capturing 4 million tons a year. We've stored about 300 million tons of CO2 just to keep it out of the air and oceans so far. It's on all kinds of stuff, a little bit in the power sector, but mostly hydrogen plants, natural gas processing facilities, ethanol facilities, chemical plants, steel mills, etc. The first project was fielded in the 30s, and the first integrated project in the 90s. It's been operating for 25 years without a problem. So we know that we can do this. And in point of fact, not only are the red dots the existing facilities, the blue dots are the ones that are coming on. And we have plenty of geological storage capacity to do it. It looks like we have on the order of 10 to 20 trillion tons of geological capacity. There's 65 projects in advanced planning. A whole bunch of them have been recently announced in the Gulf of Mexico and other places. and I expect we're going to see more. And again, these are not meant to be a substitute for anything else. They are meant to augment and accelerate decarbonization and energy access. In short, this is a mature, cost-effective technology for CO2 reduction. The reason I mention it here is because it is also a component of CO2 removal for many of the pathways which matter. Let's start by what we're really talking about here when we talk about CO2 removal. There's many ways to get the job done. One perennial favorite, trees. Trees do a good job of removing CO2 from the air and oceans. We love them. We need a lot more of them. Farms and soil carbon restoration is another way to get the job done. Blue carbon, this is restoring degraded wetlands, things like mangrove forests and stuff like that on the coasts. There's lots of stuff that you can do that is worth doing. You can also have completely engineered solutions. A favorite that I'll talk about here is direct air capture. Things like CO2 recycling to concrete, ocean alkalinity enhancement is another way to go about it. One can also imagine accelerating natural pathways. These are often called hybrid solutions. Things like carbon mineralization or bioenergy are examples of that. How much of this are we going to need? Probably all of it, probably at an enormous scale, and that is on top of the other mitigation that we need. There's a lot of new activity on CO2 removal, which is good. Aspects of this are in the American Jobs Plan, on the bipartisan infrastructure plan, in the reconciliation bill. Our other speakers will be talking about that themselves. I don't want to steal their thunder. Some of this has already been authorized and funded in the 2020 omnibus. It's important to know that we're also seeing a lot of companies getting into this space. Tech companies, aviation companies, energy companies, manufacturers, heavy industrial producers like Dow, Lafarge, ArcelorMittal. All of this is welcome. And again, it means that they are starting to take the work seriously as they try to figure out how to enter this space and be productive. The orange boxes here are just 3 that I'm going to talk about briefly. I'm happy to talk about any and all of these. At some point, I'll come back and give the 9-hour version of this talk. But in the meantime, I'm going to spend about 9 minutes talking about these other ones here. Let's start with direct air capture because it's a beautiful end member and it clarifies the point. This is now the world's largest direct air capture plant. It's in the Heltisheide facility in Reykjavik, Iceland. And here, the company's Climeworks, it sucks about 4,000 tons of CO2 out of the air and oceans every year and mineralizes it in rocks directly underneath. This is what it looks like up close. It's pretty big. This does the work of 200,000 trees and with 1,000 times less space. That's kind of interesting. If we need volume and rate, facilities like this can provide it. Although that's the biggest one today, it's not the largest one announced. Carbon Engineering and Occidental Petroleum with a company called 1.5 are in fact building a megaton project, 1 million tons a year. And this is probably going to be combined with a combination of enhanced oil recovery and geological storage. This does not exist yet, but in point of fact, it is on track for commissioning in 2025. 1 million tons, that starts to get interesting. If we had 1,000 of those, we'd have 1 billion tons. And that's really what we're talking about with direct air capture. As I said, a lot of companies are buying this already. And in fact, it's increasingly being integrated in financial tech instruments. FinTech companies like Stripe and Shopify are looking to partner with companies so that when you make a purchase on their site, they start removing CO2 with it. We saw the financial and insurance company Swiss Re put $1 million into this effort. And in fact, you can just go on their website and buy some yourself if this is of interest to you. This is just the voluntary market. Ultimately, if we're serious about this, it's got to be replaced by a compliance market. You have to figure out ways to get CO2 removal into conventional regulation and business, and that looks a little different than it does today. As an example of what they've done, Microsoft, Stripe, and Shopify bought CO2 removal. That data is represented here. And we learned something from this. This was recently published in Nature magazine. Lucas Joppa, myself, and a bunch of others published this. And this is just the sense of what was on the market, what the offerings were. And let me say that not a lot of this stands up to scrutiny. And not a lot of this lasts very long. The overwhelming majority of what was put out there was pretty short term, 10 years duration, 30 years at the outside. And in fact, a lot of it we did not think merited investment. It was the case, though, that there was a whole lot of stuff in there, stuff like converting biomass into bio-oils and injecting it underground, direct air capture, other things that looked pretty promising. But this range of volumes, range of durability and stuff highlighted a couple of challenges in the market. At the end of the day, the authors of this paper agreed that we missed three things if we're going to have a market that's real. We need a meaning, and by meaning, that means we need to all agree on what net zero means. We need measurement. We need to be able to quantify CO2 removals and validate them in the marketplace. And then third, we need markets. Today, in the market, there's no supply, there's no demand, there's no transparency, there's no regulation, and there's no actual exchange. Other than that, the market's perfect. So we need to really build these markets, and the paper makes the case for contracting as a vehicle by which that can get done. I'm happy to talk more about that soon. Direct air capture is interesting. We think the costs are going to come down pretty fast as we deploy this stuff. And at that point, it's policy relevant. And we'll talk more about those policies in a little bit. But we think that we can probably get below $100, certainly $200 a ton by mid-century, and really by 2030. We think that by 2030, we can get below $200 a ton in a lot of places. If that's the truth, then this becomes cheaper than a great many things. And in point of fact, at $200 a ton, the cost for saving the earth gets a lot cheaper. At $200 a ton, you can shave $5 trillion off the cost of stabilizing the atmosphere. State of California looked at this themselves. They said, how do we get to net zero for real? And they basically said, we're ambitious, we got all this stuff to do. They realized that no matter how much reduction they put into the system, they had an irreducible fraction, and that they needed by 2045 to start removing about 125 million tons a year. They looked at everything they could do. Some of that's trees. That's at the far end here. That's maybe 20% of the solution. They looked at direct air capture. They were enthusiastic about it. But really 70% is making hydrogen from biomass combined with carbon capture. Biohydrogen is in fact a really, really good option for this stuff. And in fact, there's lots of different sources. This report, they looked at what they could make, everything from municipal solid waste to agro residues to forestry residues. You put all this stuff together and in fact combined it with CCS, you were basically making carbon negative hydrogen. And the prize here is quite big, actually. In our most recent work, in partnership with the Global CCS Institute, it looks like you can make carbon negative hydrogen that unemits as much as a conventional hydrogen plant emits. It looks like you can remove more CO2 than a coal gasification unit emits. It looks like you can remove a lot more CO2 than a steam methane reformer emits. And so in point of fact, this is a way to make large volumes of a very valuable product in a way that actually removes large volumes of CO2 from the airs and oceans. Last is kind of a sleeper. This is mineralization, and I'm a geologist. I got to tell you, I like rocks. In point of fact, nature's been doing this a long time. We've known that CO2 is removed from the air and ocean by chemical weathering, and in fact, there's a great place to look at this stuff. If you ever want to go to Oman, you can see this stuff in real time and in real color. A couple of companies have decided that they're excited about this. One of these is called 4401. And they are basically in the process of drilling a well to inject CO2 from the air and mineralize it underneath Oman. Good work if you can get it. I think they just raised 35 million bucks for their A round. There's another company that had another clever idea. They said, let's just grind up the rocks that do the job. We're going to spread them out. And we're going to use the land as a capture medium. And this is their founder, Shashank. And they think that they can get hundreds of millions, if not billions of tons in the next 15 years, essentially by enhanced engineering of a natural process. We're pretty enthusiastic about this company, Heirloom, but this kind of innovation is just one of the things that's starting to come forward into the world. I want to be clear that this is not really about cost. Deployment of CO2 removal is really about finance. And this is a piece of work we did recently at the center, looking at all of the existing policies and various subsidies. One of my favorite here, cash for clunkers. Cash for clunkers is between $300 and $400 a ton. Solar PV subsidies between, say, $150 and many, $2,000 a ton. The low carbon fuel standards that is between $200 and $2,000 a ton, $3,000 a ton. Batteries pretty expensive in here. But when you look at that compared with conventional carbon capture and storage, and when you look at that compared to things like direct air capture is well within the range of policies that already exist. It's well within the range of policies that already exist. And direct air capture is more expensive than the other ones. It's more expensive than mineralization. It's more expensive than biohydrogen and related policies. And this is reflected now in the policy discussion in the world. The policy and political dynamic is nonlinear and changing quickly. But we've seen the United Kingdom declare net zero. We've seen Saudi Arabia declare net zero. We've seen all of these countries put money into this for real. And in fact, we have the live representations of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill that have large provisions in here for policy. Again, I won't talk about those in the interest of time, and because we'll talk about it more later. I am often asked, what is it really going to take for us to do this? And I show this picture of an old friend, Walter Monk, when people ask me what it really takes. Walter was actually at Pope Francis's first Laudate Si conference, and he was asking, how do we actually take care of God's creation? And Walter left that meeting saying that what it will really take is an unprecedented act of generosity and love. And in fact, that is really part of the work as well. We need to cultivate generosity as much as we cultivate finance and technology and policy, because at the end of the day, this is a team sport. Everybody gets to contribute to CO2 removal and solving these climate challenges. I would love to talk more, but I'm going to stop now and instead open the floor to others and create an opportunity to hear from all y'all out in the audience.
Dr. Friedmann, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to have to apologize to everyone. My camera's going in and out, but my voice is still working. So hopefully my camera will cooperate for the rest of our presentation. I'd like to welcome back to our group our two panelists and more formally introduce them to you. Erin Burns, as I said, is the executive director of Carbon 180, which is a climate nonprofit NGO focused on the full range of the carbon removal solutions. And we're excited to hear about her work. She's a native of Southern West Virginia, and more specifically, Wayne County. For those of you interested in where in South West Virginia, and has worked on these issues that we've even discussed in seminars over the summer about coal workers and coal community transition. She holds a degree in cultural anthropology from Carnegie Mellon University. So welcome, Erin. Our second panelist is Dr. Emily Grubert. She is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Carbon Management for the U.S. Department of Energy. By background as a civil engineer and environmental sociologist who studies and informs these decision makings on infrastructure, specifically related to justice centering, decarbonization, and all those equity issues that come into that. Understand that she's on leave from Georgia Tech to serve in the Department of Energy at this point, holds her PhD in environmental resources from Stanford. So we welcome you as well. So what we'll ask both of our panelists to do, and since I did it in this order of introduction, I'll ask Erin for you to go first, if that's all right, to just kind of comment. And Emily, please stay on the camera. We want all our panelists here. Thank you. Just comment on what Dr. Friedmann said, what your group is doing in the carbon removal, what you see as the big issues, and what might work best for West Virginia, if we could add that part into it as well.
Those are my favorite things to talk about. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I don't get we were talking at the beginning of this, I don't get to talk to West Virginians all the time about this. So I'll start by saying I saw a lot of, this comes up all the time, and I saw a lot of questions in the chat about this. So I do want to make a distinction that Julio made, or emphasize a distinction that Julio made, which is the difference between what we call carbon capture and what we call carbon removal. So carbon capture is what we're talking about when we install technology on a power or industrial plant to take those emissions from the smokestack. Carbon removal is actually something really different in a lot of ways. What we're talking about doesn't necessarily relate at all to fossil fuels. You can scale up carbon removal in ways that are totally divorced from fossil fuel production and extraction. And I think in particular, I would say that's what we're excited about, which is where you're pulling carbon removal, is where you're pulling existing emissions, existing carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere. And when you look, as Julio said, at the climate models, you see that there's a lot of carbon removal that it gets deployed in these climate models. And I think a lot of us can understand why, right? We already, as again, Julio mentioned, are experiencing the impacts of climate change now. We already have too many CO2 emissions. And I will say something for us is that it's actually not about, we actually think a lot about legacy emissions. So addressing that CO2 that we've already emitted. I think it is incredibly important for us and for West Virginia to not think of this as something that is an offset. This is not a way to slow down mitigation. This is not a way to keep extracting and burning fossil fuels. We need to stop doing that. We need to switch to renewables. We need to decarbonize our economy. We also are going to need to pull some of that carbon out of the atmosphere. Again, we're already facing those impacts of climate change right now. And I will say, and I'm so interested that I will say there's another person, Rory Jacobson, who's our Deputy Director of Tech Policy, who is brilliant on this, knows so much about carbon removal. Everybody should look him up, but is on this. And we were talking about how fantastic and interesting all of these questions are. So I'm really excited to be here. But I do want to comment on the West Virginia piece before I hand it over to Emily. I actually think for a long time, people have talked about the opportunities around employment in places like West Virginia around point source carbon capture. And I think that that promise has never really appeared in any meaningful way. And I actually think that carbon removal is something that could potentially be a lot more interesting for West Virginia as a whole, because we're talking about, as Julio mentioned, a really broad suite of solutions. So we can think about things like small scale, high value agriculture. There is obviously not major agriculture production like there might be in California. But we do have certain high value ag production in West Virginia. I think a lot of us who are West Virginians have the experience of running smaller scale family farming, things like that. And there's stuff that's happening across the state that's really interesting there. You could think about the role of preserving and expanding our national forest and our forestry. That's something that has played, ecotourism and things like that have played a bigger role in West Virginia's economy in recent years. And you can think about technologies like direct air capture, and where you could see everything from domestic supply chains. There was a Rhodium Group report that showed that you could imagine that there could be up to 300,000 US jobs if we scale direct air capture. And that would look like things like steel manufacturing, but also thinking about some of those power plant workers who may work at direct air capture facilities. No, much like, I don't want to say, carbon removal is not a silver bullet for West Virginia's future, but I think could be an interesting part of it. And I want to just wrap up by saying a couple of the questions hit on this, but one thing that I think is really important is not just how much of carbon removal we deploy, that's really important, but also how we deploy it. We have started to do more environmental justice engagement because it's important for us that this is, when we're talking about scaling up carbon, we're talking about good union jobs. We're talking about community engagement on where this is deployed and in what ways. We're talking about who makes money from this, who's going to profit from these technologies and practices. And I think if there's anything that we've learned in West Virginia from coal, is to make sure that if it's deployed in West Virginia, it's West Virginians making money from our labor and resources, and those benefits coming into the state and not being exported out or not coming back into our state. And so I think I would, we have a report out. My colleague, our Deputy Director of Policy at BECOSAR, Vanessa Suarez, others on our team who lead our environmental justice work, put out a report called Removing Forward, which looks at what a more environmentally just version of carbon removal will look like. So I would just end with that, saying that I really appreciate all these questions. And I do think it's something where, when we're talking about carbon removal specifically, we can talk about in ways that are totally decoupled from fossil fuel production. And I think what we hope is that at the beginning of this sort of scale up of these sectors, that we can think about the ways that we do it and the ways that this can benefit communities, and certainly in places like West Virginia. And I'll hand it over to Emily.
Great, Erin. I appreciate that very much. You definitely answered several of the questions asked, and brought up some of the environmental justice issues that go along with any kind of carbon removal type of process, as well as the point source capture, as well as decarbonizing transportation and all of the other things that go into it. But we're kind of focused today on the carbon removal aspect of it as well. So Emily, I'd ask you to give us the federal perspective, if you will, and perhaps add into the environmental justice perspective.
Absolutely. And I think I'd like to echo a lot of what Julio and Erin have already said. I think from my perspective, so I manage the Carbon Management Office, which is part of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. We added carbon management as a core strategy and core piece of our office back in July to the name. And we're really trying to orient a lot of the work that we do in R&D. So DOE is an R&D organization, not a policy organization or a regulator, but we've been spending a lot of our time really trying to understand how our R&D really moves us toward this net zero emissions economy by 2050. Obviously, interim goals in that, so 50% emissions reduction by 2030 relative to a 2005 baseline, and then a fully decarbonized power sector by 2035. A lot of the way that we think about our work within carbon management is really trying to think not just about mitigation. So to Erin's point, carbon capture and storage that we do for mitigation reasons is distinct from carbon dioxide removal. We work on both. And I think one of the reasons that we work on both is because we are trying to really address that point of don't let the emissions get to the atmosphere in the first place. A lot of what we've been working with on the point source mitigative carbon capture and storage side lately has really been focused on the issues that we think are going to continue to be CO2 emitters kind of into the future. So existing industries that we expect to be operating where we can actually add carbon capture and storage to reduce the amount that accumulates in the atmosphere. What that looks like is largely things like industrial facilities. So making cement, for example, you basically heat carbonate rocks on fire and then CO2 emissions come as a byproduct of that. So things like that we expect to be issues long into the future really do drive a lot of how we think about getting to net zero with this focus on mitigation first. To also address a couple of the questions I saw in the chat and kind of expand on what's already been said, this is also part of the reason why we're extraordinarily focused on methane mitigation. So my office is carbon management. We focus on CO2. Our other office that does R&D is resource sustainability. And one of their core efforts right now is methane mitigation to really ensure that once we do get to the point of energy use, those upstream emissions are also as little as they possibly can be. To then move into the carbon dioxide removal piece, we're really excited about where that opportunity is taking us into the future. So we're, again, mitigation first. And I think that that's something that drives everything that we do in DOE. Net zero is a lot easier the closer you get to zero. And if we can get to zero, then great. But if we can't, then you do actually need some carbon dioxide removal. And if we want to move into a place where we're doing net negative emissions eventually, that's where the CDR stuff really does come into play. I think one of the things that maybe surprises some people is that in fossil energy and carbon management, we're really focused on CDR as a really broad and diverse pathway set. So not just direct air capture, the kind of technology oriented thing that looks a lot more like a scrubber you might put on a power plant. We've been thinking a lot about biomass carbon removal and storage, or bikers, as well as things like enhanced mineralization, some of which maybe involves some mine waste reclamation opportunities, and then also looking at things like soil carbon sequestration and forestation. We're very much at the beginning of all of this, but we're really excited about moving into a space where we're dealing with CDR in this broad-based way. To get to the environmental justice point, and then I'll stop talking, we can go into questions. One of the things that we're really excited about is that as an R&D organization, we're not just testing technology implementation, we're testing a wide variety of research questions that we actually need to understand before we can move forward with carbon dioxide removal. One of those things is governance structures, we think about scale and things like that. So as we kind of put some of our projects into place, we're thinking very, very hard about how we not only demonstrate that these things can work and actually result in CO2 that was in the atmosphere no longer being in the atmosphere permanently, but also whether we can test, who should own this, how big should it be, what fits into a community, and what do communities need to know before these things get deployed. Really thinking about justice from the perspective of these kind of power analyses, as well as a lot of the potential co-benefits of some CDR technologies. So some of the research that we're looking into is really trying to evaluate what the air pollution co-benefits might be for certain types of scrubbing activities, but also things like soil carbon sequestration, improved fertility, like things like that. Each different CDR pathway could potentially have alternative co-benefits, and we're really trying to understand how those integrate into communities so that we can provide as much good information as we can. I will end really quickly. My West Virginia connection is that I actually worked outside of Montgomery about 10 years ago, mostly on acid mine drainage and mountaintop removal. So this notion of trying to correct legacy issues is very close to home. And so it's really great to be here tonight.
Emily, just to have another West Virginia connection, that's where my grandmother's family. She grew up
Really?
in a town outside of Montgomery. Yeah, she went
Amazing.
to WV Tech. Yeah.
Amazing.
By the way, shout out to everybody at National Energy Technology Lab, by the way. I miss you guys, and I'm glad that you're working with Emily and Erin and others.
Yeah, they're definitely based in part in Morgantown. So that's a group that we're very aware of and very proud of as West Virginians. All three of you have said stuff that we could talk about any one point for an hour or so. But let me just kind of combine a couple of audience questions and some of the things particularly that Julio spoke about, but all three of you spoke about. And that's the business and the marketplace, if you will, is getting involved in this, is doing that. But you all three have talked about going to scale, bringing the cost down to the point where it can be done. Is this something that the market itself can do, or is the government going to need to get involved beyond its role now of R&D into a more incentive-based type of involvement? So how does the market work in this? How does the government work in this?
So it is, I think, hysterical to imagine that energy markets operate outside of the government. They don't. They're heavily regulated. The power sector, fuel production, almost every aspect of the energy system in the United States has, in fact, government policy in it. It is also the case that the climate solutions that are coming forward are also heavily contingent on policy, whether it's the investment tax credit or the production tax credit or renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards or low carbon fuel standards and mandates or renewable fuel standards. All of these things have a policy imprimatur. And in fact, ultimately, we are going to need government engagement for a handful of things. One of them is, in fact, to create those market aligning policies. And Erin and Emily know so much more about that than I am. Not even going to sort of dwell on that one. But it is also the case that we need rules and we need standards, and those don't exist either. In financial markets, you have something like the Securities and Exchange Commission that avoids fraudulent behavior. We do not have that in Carbonville. Eventually, we will need it. We will need some kind of standard that everybody agrees on as to what is actually CO2 removal and exactly how does it work. Let me add that we also are going to need, what's the right way to say this? We lack so many aspects of the market. We don't have like an exchange that's regulated. We have like a really small voluntary market. And so at the end of the day, we're going to need compliance markets. And I talked about that a little bit. By compliance market, take it, for example, the low carbon fuel standard in California. That ratchets down the fuel content of all California fuels sold. Direct air capture is one compliance mechanism within that market. You can do electric vehicles, you can do hydrogen, you can do all kinds of things, but direct air capture is a compliance option. There's something similar in the aviation industry called the CORSIA standard, which requires all civilian aviation to reach a net zero target in the future. Right now, those are all biofuels. All of the mechanisms I talked about, biohydrogen, CO2 mineralization, direct air capture, none of that is a compliance option. So we're just starting to see that emerge in the United Kingdom as a compliance option. We're just starting to see this emerge in the United States in a couple of jurisdictions. Ultimately, we're going to need more of these kinds of policies and market alignment if we're going to really see this stuff take off. We're not going to get a gigaton on the voluntary market. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and I'll add here, I mean, when we talk about carbon removal, what we're talking about is not something that produces energy. It doesn't, for the most part, produce any product. We're talking about something that's sort of a public good. And so you need policy if you're talking about scaling that. And I think the other thing I'd say is that, to Julio's point, you don't really have policies behind all of it, shapes all of it. And, you know, when we look at challenges to deployment for things like large scale direct air capture, you have to capture that CO2. That's expensive. So we have to talk about policy to support that and bring down the cost, but also you have to store it. And we have, as Julio pointed out, knows way better than I do, really fantastic geology in the US to do that. But to do that, you need a permit, which makes sense, right? You want to make the EPA make sure that when you store that, you pick the right site and it doesn't, you know, impact drinking water. It doesn't have any negative impacts, period, or minimizes impacts like that. So you need to get a permit for that, which of course makes a lot of sense. But to get a Class 6 permit, which is kind of permit you need, it takes a really, really long time because it's a program that doesn't get a lot of federal support at this point. It's really underfunded. And Julio mentioned a bunch of bills and pieces of legislation that are moving forward. And one thing is to provide more funding for this program so that they can make sure that that we're able to issue those permits, and those permits are well managed. And so it's just sort of, when you're talking about anything, any climate action, you're really talking about what kinds of policies are going to shape that. And the final thing I'll say is I think it is also really important, again, to go back to how this is deployed. And to make sure that we have sort of those guardrails and making sure that this is deployed in communities that want it in ways that are beneficial to those communities. And I think especially the work that Emily's doing, we're so excited to have people like Emily at the Office of Fossil Energy right now pushing this forward. And I think, you know, some of the funding opportunities they've pushed out and other initiatives are looking at that really robust community engagement and really and ways that we're just like, I can say, you know, we're just so excited about. So I think that policy is also going to shape how the system, not just decide if we are going to meet our climate goals or not, but how we're going to meet them. And I think that's super important.
I will add really quickly, because I know we have lots and lots of things to talk about tonight. One of the things that we talk a lot about as an R&D organization is the fact that even if we got costs to zero, there's actually no market mechanism to deploy these types of things. That's part of the reason why we do look at a lot of different ways that we think this could work. So when I was talking earlier about really needing to test things beyond just the technology, one of those things is governance structures. So we're thinking a little bit about, you know, can we actually deploy CDR in a manner that is utility owned, or can we deploy it in a way that's community owned, like we see with some solar facilities, in addition to being private markets? So that one, this notion of how is this industry actually going to develop, given that it's really a pollution control issue and not really a product that's necessarily been sold, is a big question that we have. I think the other one is really trying to understand what the potential ultimate compliance mechanism is going to be, because like I said, we've oriented a ton of our work, actually really at DOE, all of what we're doing is really driving toward this net zero emissions economy by 2050. But that's an executive order. And so really trying to understand what this looks like long-term in a way that is resilient to change and really provides this long-term signal as to what actually is needed in these areas is something else that we're watching quite closely.
Thank you. And I appreciate everybody's comments on that. We've asked a couple of kind of broad questions. So I'd like to narrow down onto one particular CDR technology, which is direct air capture. And this is going to kind of combine some of the questions that come from the audience about trade-offs that we have to have. If we're going to go afforestation, reforestation, and plant lots of trees, well, we'll give up agricultural land or something else. So there's trade-offs. One of the concerns about direct air capture and getting it to scale is that it takes energy to run direct air capture. For example, the Iceland project is, we believe, geothermal, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but is that something that can be combined with non-carbon type of energy, you know, solar panels or windmills on abandoned mine lands, for example, fueling this to avoid the use of carbon fuels for this very good direct air capture?
I have a very timely response to this, actually, which is that our office issued a funding opportunity announcement this morning, I think, for basically coupling direct air capture to either nuclear, geothermal, or waste heat. And so we're actually really, really excited about looking into some of these zero carbon inputs to direct air capture. But I think the core of the question is really important. Like, these things take energy. That means you need more energy. And so really trying to understand some of the life cycle impacts of these projects is also understanding how much marginal energy system you need to actually build out. One of the things that we are interested in testing from kind of a research perspective on the technology side is how flexible these types of operations might be. At this point, they're very capital intensive, and so you want to kind of run them as much as you can. But hypothetically, you could get into a situation where you're looking at flexible operations that could help accommodate some of the variability that we see with a lot of renewables and things. Based on some of the papers that people have been working very hard on, I think the expectation is that once about 25% of your energy load is associated with these kind of big flexible things, you actually do probably need to start building out more energy resources. But this is also part of why a lot of our analytical work is really focused on understanding not just average inputs, but marginal inputs to these types of processes. So we recognize, again, mitigation is the priority. Direct air capture doesn't really work until the entire energy system is decarbonized, because if you are adding additional load to a system that is still using non-mitigated sources, you really need to be very careful about your carbon accounting. So yeah, very much top of mind, but we're really, really excited about this funding opportunity announcement.
Yeah, and I'll say, listen, Emily and people like Jen Wilcox at FE like know infinitely more than I do about this. My layperson's suggestion is, if you haven't seen it, there's a website you can go to called, and I'm happy to share the link, road-to-10gigatons.com. And it's actually just a really engaging, it's like a little game. You don't have to know anything about carbon removal, but it like goes through at a very like accessible way, the sort of trade-offs through different carbon removal solutions and how you get to that 10 gigaton level that we need, and balancing across those solutions. So it's also like a really just like engaging way to think about this and to learn about it if you're sort of new to carbon removal.
Right. So a couple of things. First of all, for 10 gigatons, like, we need everything. The national academies, the Royal Philosophical Society, the IEA, MIT, Stanford, like everybody serious who studied this acknowledges that to get 10 gigatons, you need everything. The trade-offs here are not between do you do trees or do you do direct air capture. It's like we need as much of both of those as we can possibly get. That's necessary. It is correct that direct air capture requires energy. So does my vacuum cleaner. And in point of fact, it used to be that the way that we cleaned rugs is we dragged them outside and hit them with sticks. And we don't do that anymore because a vacuum cleaner is better. And this is really what we're talking about. Sure, we need energy. And there are places where the energy requirements mean you won't do direct air capture there because you'll prefer to do something else. Yes, that makes all the sense in the world. If you have a lot of renewable energy and you can displace an emitting source using it, terrific, you should do that. But there's many parts in the world where that's not the case. There's many parts of the world where there's abundant renewable energy or opportunities for cheap nuclear or working off the existing nuclear plants. There's opportunities for geothermal development. There's opportunities for harnessing solar and wind in geographies that want economic development. So there's absolutely ways to think about doing this in a way that develop growth and stimulate growth that where the energy requirements for something like direct air capture, yeah, it's part of the mix. But in fact, that's just how it goes. I would point to some of the scholars, somebody like Olufemi Taiwo, who see something like direct air capture as a potential engine for North-South redress, where actually the global North can start cleaning up their mess like a vacuum cleaner, but actually doing it in a way that creates economic opportunity in developing nations. There's ways in which that can go wrong. It's up to us to make sure that something like that's done well.
Let me do a couple of lightning questions if I can. One of the first questions we got in from our participant was a John Kerry quote that 90% of the carbon emissions come from outside of the United States. We can go to zero tomorrow and still haven't solved the problem. That's basically what the Trump administration did. They changed from studying world carbon to US carbon, and they fiddled with the discount rate and came up with a different social cost of carbon. So how do we put all this together in a lightning round question with the international things like IPCC and some of those things?
My quick lightning round comment is that when we're talking about carbon removal, talking about legacy emissions, we're actually talking about the US having a really enormous, I feel like you can't say the word ton, that's confusing in this context, but we're talking about a very different set of responsibilities. And we think that the US, who one has emitted enormous amount of carbon dioxide over the history of the country, and who's been able to, industrialize on that without any sort of like thought of climate change, has an enormous amount of responsibility in cleaning that up.
Yeah, lightning round on top of Erin's, like, we control ourselves. And if the whole goal is to get everybody to zero, we have to start with ourselves.
The international collaboration is required, and the US should figure out a way to lead that. And in fact, CO2 removal is an example of where and how we can lead. Things like the direct air capture hubs, things like the direct US Department of Agriculture programs, there's all kinds of ways in which we can partner with other countries like the UK and Canada or the Gulf states or the EU and actually get a larger coalition. It is the work. It's neither good nor bad. I can be optimistic or pessimistic. The work looks the same, and international partnerships part of the work.
Great. Another lightning question. Focusing now back on West Virginia, we obviously don't have mangrove wetlands and oceans, but on your slide with the 9 or 10 CDR technologies, what do you all think? And in some political climates, it's better to talk about jobs than to talk about climate change or some of these other topics. So what do you think of these particular options for carbon dioxide removal would produce the most jobs in West Virginia or in any area of the United States?
Let me start with that one super fast. For starters, you can make stuff. Like, we're going to need to make a bunch of stuff here. We're going to make gasifiers. You need to make CO2 removal devices. There's all kinds of things that the state can make. In terms of its resources, again, the forestry resources of the state are substantial. There's some way to think about using that in a virtuous way that has not yet been fully harnessed. Last but not least, and I really don't want to underplay this stuff, I want to overplay this stuff. The scarcest resource in Carbonville is human capital. We do not have enough smart people. West Virginia can absolutely make those and put those out into the marketplace. And you have world-class universities on this topic, which actually can serve a global market in a very real way.
Erin, Emily, would you like to add to that?
Look, I think I may be a skeptic. I mentioned that I think carbon removal can be something that's really interesting in West Virginia. I think that policy can play a big role in what that looks like. But, I think it's something where it's going to be the best version of that is sort of like we're not just saying one, we're going to build a bunch of direct air capture there. Maybe we will, maybe that'll work out. But it's sort of what's interesting to me about the future of West Virginia and carbon removal is that you can think about all of these different pathways where you can think about, what you might grow on reclaimed mountaintop mining sites. That's always a conversation, right? Or you can think about, like what role forestry could play in that and how that could, be a part of West Virginia's economic future. And so I do think, to Julio's point, you can think about manufacturing, you can think about, direct air capture to products and all kinds of things like that. I think it'll be really important to really dive into the details about what kinds of projects these communities want. And I think really rely on a lot of that research coming out of DOE, including at work at NETL that's looking at local co-benefits and air pollution and all of those pieces. So I think it's something that's like really in the details for how, and it's something I think is really important for like West Virginians to make a decision on, what part of their future do they want to involve, or include carbon removal.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Erin. My +2 fingers point here, I think, is that we kind of don't know exactly where these things are going to be, what they're going to look like, who's going to work there, how that's going to be. And that's part of what the design process is really about, is figuring out what do we want this to look like and how do we get as close to that vision of a future that is more just and more sustainable and really gets us toward these climate goals. And, let's design that. But we don't quite know yet.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And I would just add, we have a lot of abandoned mine lands that would be a great place for a DAC test project. But we're coming up to about the end of the hour. We've had fabulous questions from our participants and our audience. And I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. Every one of them would be a webinar in and of themselves. But what we'd like to ask each of our panelists, and then Dr. Friedmann is our featured speaker, is to take a moment or two and tell us what would you like us to take away from your work or what your group or agency is doing with regard to carbon removal. What's the minute and a half takeaway? So I'll do in reverse order this time. Emily, if I could start with you, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main takeaway is that this is something that we anticipate is going to be necessary. It's something that we anticipate is going to be large, and it's something that we anticipate is going to be difficult. And I think what a lot of the goal that I hope people come away with this from is really trying to understand how we do this really well. I want to be really directly honest, like there are ways we could do this poorly, but there are a lot of people working very, very hard to try to not do it poorly. And there are pathways where this is done really well and really provides a really important net benefit to the world, both for a variety of international justice issues, for local justice issues, and a lot of different sustainability goals. So we can get there, but it's going to be a hard road and we need help.
Emily said it so perfectly. I think that's the most exciting thing. We're at the beginning of this thing that could be really massive. And I totally agree, Emily. We can do it in ways that are harmful, but we can also do it in ways that are great. I mean, we can do it in ways that redress environmental injustices and create high-paying jobs and drive wealth into communities and do all of that while we fix climate change. And I think it's really exciting and important to, somebody asked in the chat, what can a person do? And I think look, I deal in policy because I think it's not about individual action at that level. It's about, we need big, massive change. But I think individuals can think about what they might want this to look like in their community, engage with local policymakers. They can engage with state level policymakers. They can push. I can say I worked in Jim Manchin's office. Every single constituent, I assume this is still the case, this was a few years ago, every email, phone call, fax that comes from a West Virginian, gets logged, gets a response, gets cataloged for the senator. So, you can use your voice to push for policy as well.
And Dr. Friedmann, we again appreciate your time very much. We may take you up on that offer of coming to talk live when we can get past this COVID and do this. But if you give us your takeaway, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Sure. So let me start with the down news. If you don't think this is hard, then you're not paying attention. Of course it's hard. It's ridiculously hard. It will be miraculous to pull off 10 billion tons of CO2 removal. It is no harder than the other many miracles we have to do to get to net zero. And so I just consider it to be one of the baker's dozen of crazy things that we need to do to create a just and verdant world. And that's where I end up on a positive note. We are not actually capital limited on this. There's money out there. We're not technology limited either. There's lots of ways to get the job done. We are limited only at this point by our values and our imagination. And that's the world I want to live in every day.
Great. Thank you very much. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Friedmann for joining us, as well as our panelists, Erin Burns and Emily Grubert. We appreciate your time very much. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors of this event, the West Virginia Center on Climate Change, the West Virginia College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, and the West Virginia University Bridge Initiative for Science and Technology Policy, Leadership and Communication. But especially, we would like to thank the people that took the time to participate and to be part of this, to ask questions, and to hear these very excellent speakers. We hope you all enjoyed our presentation on carbon removal and more, what lies ahead. I hope we've got some good information to take with you. This is the type of event that the West Virginia Center on Climate Change does put on. We're starting to plan our spring and next year schedule of programming like this. We like to bring recognized leaders in academia, government, nonprofits, community groups to bring evidence-based, science-based type of research. If you'd like to get involved with that, we'd certainly appreciate any help you can give us. Again, thanks to our panelists. Thank you, Dr. Friedmann. And most of all, thank all of you all for attending. Appreciate it. And we'll conclude for tonight. Thank you very much.